March 15, 2016. Frank Kellerman had been running from his past for 25 years. The man who once coordinated stunts for the biggest action stars in Hollywood now worked $50,000 indie films in North Hollywood warehouses. That Tuesday morning, Arnold Schwarzenegger walked onto Frank's set uninvited. No entourage, no security, just Arnold, wearing sunglasses and a knowing smile that made Frank's blood freeze. 300 cast and crew members stopped working. Phones came out. Everyone thought it was a surprise cameo, a publicity stunt. But Frank knew better. Arnold hadn't spoken to him since 1991. Since the night 3 stuntmen died on Terminator 2. Since Frank took the blame and buried the truth. Arnold walked straight to Frank, removed his sunglasses, and whispered 4 words that shattered everything. "We need to talk. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." Frank's hands trembled as he set down his clipboard. Around them, the warehouse buzzed with whispered speculation, but to Frank it sounded like static, white noise drowning out the present while dragging him back to 1991. "Arnold." Frank's voice came out as a croak. 25 years of cigarettes and guilt had carved it down to gravel. "What are you doing here?" The Austrian oak looked exactly as Frank remembered, just older. The same predatory intelligence behind those ice-blue eyes, the same way of standing that made everyone else feel smaller. Arnold's smile never wavered as he glanced around the cramped set, a pathetic mockery of the massive productions they'd once commanded together. "Nice operation you have here," Arnold said, his accent thick with mock admiration. "Very intimate." Frank caught the director, Marcus Chen, approaching with a star-struck expression. Frank waved him off with a sharp gesture that sent the young filmmaker retreating to a safe distance. Whatever this was about, it couldn't happen in front of the crew. "We should go to my office," Frank muttered. "No." Arnold's voice carried the same authority it had when he was the biggest action star on the planet. "Walk with me instead." Without waiting for an answer, Arnold headed toward the loading dock exit. Frank followed, his legs feeling like concrete. Behind them, he heard someone whisper, "Holy shit, that's really him," and the soft click of phone cameras. This would be all over social media within the hour. The March afternoon hit them with unexpected warmth as they stepped outside. The warehouse sat in an industrial stretch of North Hollywood where legitimate film productions came to die quiet deaths. Across the street, a homeless encampment had sprouted between 2 abandoned lots. The contrast with the Culver City studios, where Frank had once reigned as king, couldn't have been starker. Arnold lit a Cuban cigar without offering one to Frank. "You look terrible, my friend." "Cut the bullshit, Arnold. Why are you here?" "Because someone wants to talk about that night. About what really happened on Stage 7. Frank's chest tightened. Stage 7. The soundstage where everything had gone wrong. Where Danny Morrison, Rick Chen and Tommy Nguyen had died in an explosion that wasn't supposed to happen. Where Frank's life had imploded along with the practical effect rig he'd designed. "I told the investigators everything." "You told them what you thought they needed to hear." Arnold took a long drag, studying Frank through the smoke. "But we both know that wasn't everything, don't we?" A metro bus wheezed past, belching diesel exhaust. Frank watched it disappear around the corner, buying himself time to think. But his mind kept flashing back to that night, the screaming, the twisted metal, the way Danny Morrison's hand had reached out from under the wreckage before going still forever. "I was the stunt coordinator," Frank said finally. "It was my rig, my responsibility. 3 good men died because I fucked up the calculations. Is that what you really believe?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Frank had asked himself the same thing 10,000 times over the past quarter century, usually at 3 a.m. when the guilt wouldn't let him sleep. He'd replayed every detail of that night, analyzed every variable, double-checked every equation. The math should have worked. The explosion should have been contained, controlled, safe. But equipment failed. Welds broke. Sometimes the universe just decided to shit on you. "The OSHA investigation cleared me of criminal negligence," Frank said. The studio settled the wrongful death suits. Case closed. Arnold flicked ash onto the cracked asphalt. Not quite. What the hell does that mean? It means someone else was there that night. Someone who knew exactly how to sabotage your rig to make it look like an accident. Arnold's eyes locked onto Frank's. Someone who's been watching you ever since, making sure you stayed quiet and kept taking the blame. Frank's vision blurred. The parking lot seemed to tilt sideways. You're lying. Am I? Arnold pulled a manila envelope from his jacket. These arrived at my office yesterday. No return address. Just photos and documents that tell a very different story about what happened on stage 7. Frank stared at the envelope like it was a rattlesnake. Inside could be answers to questions that had tortured him for decades. Or it could be something worse. Proof that his guilt was justified, that his mistakes had been even more catastrophic than he'd known. Why bring this to me? Frank whispered. Why now? Because whoever sent these wants us to find the truth. And because Arnold's expression grew serious for the first time since he'd arrived. Because Tommy Nguyen's daughter is asking questions. She's hired a private investigator, and she's getting close to something that certain people don't want her to find. The warehouse door banged open behind them. Marcus Chen stuck his head out, looking nervous. Frank, we really need to get back to shooting. We're losing the light. Frank nodded absently, his attention still fixed on the envelope in Arnold's hands. Inside that warehouse, his crew was waiting to film another forgettable action sequence for another movie that would disappear without a trace. It was safe work, predictable work, work that didn't get anyone killed, but the envelope promised something else entirely, the truth about the worst night of his life. Frank took the envelope with hands that felt disconnected from his body. The manila paper was warm from Arnold's jacket and heavier than it should have been. Through the thin material, he could feel the sharp edges of photographs, the bulk of documents that might rewrite everything he thought he knew about himself. I need to think about this, Frank said, tucking the envelope inside his worn leather jacket. The weight of it pressed against his ribs like a tumor. Arnold nodded, dropping his cigar and crushing it under a polished boot that probably cost more than Frank made in a month. Don't take too long. Tommy's daughter, her name is Linda, she's not going to stop. And if she finds the wrong person first, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Why do you care what happens to me? For a moment, Arnold's movie star facade cracked, revealing something raw underneath. Because I was supposed to be in that stunt too, remember? Last-minute script change moved my scene to the next day. Could have been me under that rubble. Frank did remember. Arnold's character was meant to emerge from the explosion in a dramatic reveal, the Terminator walking through flames, unstoppable. Instead, 3 men had died, and Arnold had filmed his scene against a green screen weeks later. The magic of Hollywood editing had erased any trace of the tragedy from the final cut. Arnold walked away without another word, climbing into a black Tesla that whispered to life and glided toward the street. Frank watched until it disappeared, then stood alone in the industrial wasteland, holding secrets that felt like burning coals. Inside the warehouse, the familiar sounds of film production continued, the hum of generators, muffled conversations, the metallic clank of equipment being repositioned. His world, his responsibility, his crew of 12 people who depended on him to keep them safe, to keep them working, to keep them from ending up like Danny, Rick, and Tommy. Marcus approached cautiously, reading Frank's expression. The kid was 28, film school graduate, full of the same dreams Frank had once carried. His grandfather had been a stuntman in Hong Kong action films, and Marcus wore that legacy like armor against Hollywood's casual cruelty. Everything okay, boss? Yeah. Frank cleared his throat. Yeah, just old friends catching up. Let's get back to work. But as they walked back inside, Frank caught Marcus studying him with worried eyes. The kid was smart, perceptive. He'd noticed how Frank's hands were shaking now, how his breathing had gone shallow. The set waited exactly as they'd left it, a mock-up of a hotel corridor dressed for a fight scene between the hero and 3 masked attackers. Simple choreography, basic stunts, nothing that required pyrotechnics or complex rigging. Frank had built his post-T2 career on simplicity, on never again creating situations where variables could cascade into catastrophe. "Positions, everyone," Marcus called out, slipping back into director mode. Same as before. "Tommy, you're coming out of room 237 on Frank's cue. Jake and Luis, remember the timing on that tackle. We don't want anyone actually hitting the floor." Frank watched his stunt performers take their marks. Tommy Vasquez, 43, divorced father of two, who'd been working with Frank for 8 years. Jake Morrison, 31, nephew of Danny Morrison, the Danny Morrison who'd died on stage 7. And Luis Santos, 26, eager and fearless, in the way that reminded Frank uncomfortably of his younger self. These men trusted him. They put their bodies on the line because they believed Frank Kellerman would never let them get hurt. The weight of that trust had once felt natural, empowering. Now it felt like drowning. "Frank?" Marcus was looking at him expectantly. "You want to walk through it one more time?" "No, they've got it." Frank pulled out his phone, pretending to check messages while his mind raced. "Rolling whenever you're ready." The envelope seemed to burn against his chest. Inside it were photographs and documents that might prove he wasn't the failure he'd believed himself to be for 25 years, or they might prove something worse, that his guilt was justified, that he'd been responsible for even more than he'd known. But worse than either possibility was the third option, that someone had deliberately murdered 3 men and let Frank carry the blame, someone who was still out there, someone who might be watching him right now. Action! The fight scene unfolded in controlled chaos. Bodies moved through choreographed violence, while Frank watched every angle, every impact, every moment where things could go wrong. This was his penance, keeping other people's children alive, one careful stunt at a time. But as the cameras rolled, Frank couldn't shake the feeling that his careful, controlled world was about to explode all over again. And this time, he might not survive the blast. "Cut! That's a wrap on the fight sequence." Marcus's voice snapped Frank back to the present. The stunt performers were already breaking character, laughing and checking each other for bruises that would bloom purple by tomorrow. Normal sounds, safe sounds, the kind of controlled violence that left everyone breathing. Frank's phone buzzed against his leg. Unknown number. He almost let it go to voicemail. After Arnold's visit, he wasn't in the mood for more surprises. But something made him answer. Kellerman. Silence stretched across the connection, filled with the soft hiss of long distance. Then a woman's voice, young and determined. "Mr. Kellerman? This is Linda Nguyen. I think we need to talk." The envelope against Frank's chest suddenly felt like it weighed 100 pounds. Tommy Nguyen's daughter, the private investigator Arnold had mentioned. Frank closed his eyes, seeing her father's face as clearly as if 25 years hadn't passed. Tommy's gap-toothed grin, his terrible jokes between takes, the way he'd always volunteered for the most dangerous stunts because he trusted Frank's calculations completely. "I don't think that's a good idea," Frank managed. "I'm standing outside your warehouse right now." Frank's head snapped up. Through the loading dock entrance he could see a silver Honda Civic parked across the street. A young Asian woman sat behind the wheel, phone pressed to her ear, watching him through the windshield. "How did you find you?" "My father kept scrapbooks. Every movie, every stunt coordinator, every crew member he ever worked with. Your name was in there a lot." Her voice carried an edge that reminded Frank uncomfortably of her father's stubborn streak, along with newspaper clippings about the accident that killed him. Marcus was calling the crew together for the next setup, but Frank waved him off and walked toward the exit. His legs felt unsteady, like the ground might give way beneath him. Linda Nguyen climbed out of her car as he approached, and Frank's breath caught in his throat. She looked exactly like her father. Same determined jaw, same intelligent eyes, same way of standing that suggested she'd fight anyone who got between her and what she wanted. She couldn't have been more than 5 when Tommy died, but she carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd spent years preparing for this moment. "Mr. Kellerman." She extended her hand. Frank shook it automatically, noting the calluses on her palms, working hands like her father's. "I've been trying to reach you for months. I've been busy. Making forgettable movies in forgotten warehouses?" The words stung because they were true. "My father died believing he was working for the best stunt coordinator in Hollywood. I want to know if that faith was justified. Frank felt the envelope shifting against his ribs with each breath. Arnold's documents, whatever they contained, burned like acid against his skin. Your father's death was investigated. The findings were conclusive. Were they? Linda reached into her purse and pulled out a manila folder, worn thin from handling. I hired an investigator 6 months ago. Amazing what you can find when you know where to look. She opened the folder, revealing photocopied police reports, OSHA documents, insurance filings, all stamped with official seals, all dated from 1991. But there were other papers too, ones Frank didn't recognize. Bank records, phone logs, travel receipts. Someone paid Gary Hendricks $25,000 3 days before the accident, Linda said, watching Frank's reaction carefully. Gary Hendricks, the special effects technician who installed the explosive charges in your rig. Frank's vision blurred. Gary Hendricks. He remembered the man, thin, nervous, always double-checking his work. Gary had been cleared by the investigation, his testimony helping establish that the explosion resulted from structural failure, not improper installation. That doesn't mean anything, Frank said, but his voice sounded hollow even to himself. Doesn't it? Linda flipped to another page. The payment came from a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. The same shell company that took out a $2 million insurance policy on the Terminator 2 production 6 weeks before filming started. The parking lot seemed to tilt sideways. Frank gripped the hood of Linda's car to steady himself, his mind racing through implications he'd never considered. Insurance fraud, deliberate sabotage, murder disguised as industrial accident. Why are you telling me this? Frank whispered. Because Gary Hendricks died of a drug overdose in 1995. Because the insurance investigator who handled the case disappeared in 1998. And because someone's been watching me ever since I started asking questions. Linda's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Someone who knows I'm getting close to the truth. Behind them, the warehouse door banged open. Marcus stepped out, concern written across his young face. Frank? Everything okay out here? Frank looked at Linda Nguyen, seeing her father's determination burning in her eyes, looked at the documents that promised to rewrite everything he'd believed about the worst night of his life, felt Arnold's envelope pressing against his chest like a loaded gun. His careful, controlled world, the world he'd built on penance and small, safe movies, was cracking apart. There was no going back now. Yeah, everything's fine, Frank called back to Marcus, his voice steadier than he felt. Just give me 5 more minutes. Marcus hesitated, clearly sensing the tension crackling between Frank and Linda, but nodded and retreated inside. The warehouse door closed with a hollow clang that seemed to echo in Frank's chest. Linda was studying him with those unsettling eyes, Tommy's eyes, waiting for a response. Frank straightened, trying to project the authority he'd once wielded on major studio lots. Look, Ms. Nguyen, I understand you want answers about your father's death, but dredging up ancient history isn't going to bring him back. Ancient history? Linda's voice sharpened. 3 men died because someone sabotaged your stunt rig. That's not history. That's murder. Even if what you're suggesting were true, which I'm not saying it is, what exactly do you want from me? I lost everything that night too. My career, my reputation, my... Frank stopped himself before admitting how many nights he'd considered joining Danny, Rick, and Tommy in whatever came after. I want you to help me find who really killed them. The words hung between them like a challenge. Frank felt the envelope shifting against his ribs with each shallow breath. Arnold's documents might contain the same information Linda had uncovered, or they might hold pieces of a puzzle that neither of them could solve alone. But opening that door meant abandoning the safe, small world he'd spent decades constructing. I can't. Frank turned toward the warehouse. I have a crew depending on me. 12 people who need this job finished so they can pay their rent and feed their kids. I won't risk their livelihoods chasing ghosts. Frank, something in Linda's tone made him stop. When he turned back, she was holding out a photograph, black and white, grainy, obviously taken with a telephoto lens. It showed 2 men in conversation outside a restaurant, their faces clearly visible under a streetlight. One of them was Gary Hendricks. The other was Kevin Walsh, the assistant director who'd been responsible for clearing Stage 7 before the stunt sequence began. Kevin, who'd given the all-clear signal. Kevin, who'd testified that Frank's safety protocols had been followed to the letter. "This was taken 4 days after the accident," Linda said quietly. "In a Denny's parking lot in Barstow. Gary paid cash for everything that week. Meals, gas, motel rooms, like he was afraid to leave a paper trail." Frank stared at the photograph, his mind reeling. Kevin Walsh had been his friend, his trusted collaborator on dozens of films. They'd shared beers after rap parties, complained about studio executives, commiserated over the impossible physics that directors demanded from their action sequences. Kevin had visited Frank in the hospital after his breakdown, had been one of the few people to stand by him when the lawsuit started flying. "Where did you get this?" "The private investigator I hired used to work insurance fraud. He knows how to follow money trails, how to spot patterns." Linda's voice carried a note of triumph mixed with something darker. "Want to know the really interesting part? Kevin Walsh left Los Angeles 6 weeks after this photo was taken, moved to Vancouver, started a new production company. Became very successful very quickly. The warehouse door opened again, and this time Marcus didn't just stick his head out. He walked over, his expression clearly worried. "Frank, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we really need to get moving. The equipment rental is only paid through 6, and we've still got 3 setups to shoot." Frank nodded absently, but his attention remained fixed on Linda's photograph. Kevin Walsh, his friend, his collaborator, his... "I know this is hard," Marcus continued, glancing nervously between Frank and Linda. "But whatever this is about, maybe it could wait until after wrap. The crew's starting to talk and—" "What kind of talk?" Linda interrupted, her investigator's instincts apparently triggered by something in Marcus's tone. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "It's probably nothing, but Jake Morrison, one of our stunt guys, he got a weird phone call during lunch break. Someone asking questions about Frank, about what movies he's working on, where he's been living." Marcus looked directly at Frank. Jake said the voice sounded familiar, but he couldn't place it. Frank felt ice spreading through his veins. Jake Morrison, Danny Morrison's nephew, the family connection that had made Frank hire him despite his limited experience. Another small piece of penance for sins that might not even be his own. "Did Jake say anything else about the call?" Linda asked, already pulling out her phone to take notes. "Just that whoever it was knew things about the old days. About Danny, about the accident on Terminator 2. Marcus's voice dropped. Jake got spooked. Said it felt like someone was checking up on Frank, making sure he was staying in his lane. Frank's hand moved unconsciously to the envelope hidden beneath his jacket. Arnold's documents, Linda's evidence, a phone call that suggested someone was watching, waiting, ensuring that certain truths remained buried. His safe, controlled world wasn't just cracking, it was collapsing entirely. And somewhere out there, the real killer was making sure Frank knew it.